One of the more controversial justice measures that the Harper government has been invoking for the last 6 years is the issue of mandatory minimums. They came about because of a feeling among many that judges were handing out sentences that were just too lenient. Some have said it ties judges' hands and takes Canada in the wrong way. And across the United States, many people that once championed mandatory minimums are now saying it's the wrong way to go. It simply fills up the jails. Is there a difference in our experience? Let's check in with Eric Sterling. He is with the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, joins us now from Washington. Good day, sir. How are you?
I'm fine, Brian. Good afternoon.
I understand that you were one of the early advocates for mandatory minimums in the United States. Initially, why did you support the idea? And then tell us why you've changed, because I understand you've had a change of heart, at least partially on this issue.
I was counsel to the House Judiciary Committee as the Congress was debating the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986 after basketball star Len Bias died from a cocaine overdose. And there was an intense feeling in the Congress that an epidemic of drug abuse had to be fought by very harsh measures. The mandatories arose out of a desire to get the Justice Department to focus on the highest level traffickers. For too long, they had been focusing on low-level cases, and we thought that long sentences for high-level traffickers would encourage prosecutors to focus. Unfortunately, we picked very small quantity triggers, and as a result, it had very little positive effect in the practices of the Justice Department. What has happened then is that we've seen people cooperating with the government, and it's called informing against family and friends in order to avoid their high-level sentences. And often this leads to perjury. The American judges have been adamant in their opposition to this, and judges have adopted resolutions calling these sentences manifestly unjust. Most importantly, they simply have not worked as tools for the prosecutors to focus on high-level cases, and we still have a terribly serious drug problem.
So are you just opposed to the imposition of mandatory minimums then when it comes to the drug issue? Because we've had people saying that you shouldn't have mandatory minimums for murders. You shouldn't have mandatory minimums for public shootings. There's very few mandatory minimums on the drug side. They actually started out more on the violent crime side. Is there a difference in how these things are applied?
Yes, we've had mandatory minimums in the United States since 1789 for various offenses, and often they might be on the order of 6 months or a year. What was striking about the drug mandatories is that they were 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And that they then became quite popular for other kinds of crimes, child pornography, things that would be considered habitual offender laws. And the problem with mandatories generally is that the Congress or the Parliament has one idea of who this law will be applied to. But the reality is that in the courts, the facts are very different. And the mandatories prevent judges from letting the punishment fit the crime. Let
me ask you about that then. Let me ask you about that. We had a case recently. We had someone who was accused of trying to sell a gun to an undercover police officer. Now, selling stolen guns, illegal guns, comes with a mandatory minimum. The police didn't wait to see if the guy had a gun. He just talked about it, and so they arrested him, charged him with this mandatory minimum offense, and the judge said, well, there's no gun, so therefore this doesn't stand, and it's unconstitutional. He actually struck down the entire law. In my view, that's a case of them misapplying the charge. He shouldn't have been charged with that. He should have been charged with something else if there's no crime. Should the discretion be more at the prosecutor level? Because someone who is out there peddling illegal guns, I mean, we have mandatory minimums of 2 and 3 years in this country. You're not going to jail for 30 for that. I think we have a very different experience than you do.
There's no question that the Canadian experience and the American experience are different. And the lessons of the American experience are do not directly map yours. The challenge is the facts that you gave are an example where if the facts were only slightly different, you might find it was still an injustice. That is, a mandatory minimum might be imposed in a case where a guy sells a gun believing that it's being represented to him that he's helping out law enforcement, that he's been asked to participate in some kind of a sting, or that there are any number of circumstances where one could imagine someone selling a gun in violation of the law, but is not a professional gun dealer, didn't steal it, but that the broad facts as laid out in the statute require that mandatory to be applied, and the judge is unable to make a more just sentence on those facts. That's I think the heart of the problem of mandatory minimums. Is that
if I can ask, we've got 1 minute left, sir. If I can ask you, what would be your advice, your brief advice for Canadians to avoid some of the pitfalls of the bad side of your experience with mandatory minimums, but still apply them in a fair and just way?
Well, you could argue that you have police who are not on a crusade and prosecutors who are not on a crusade, who take their responsibility not as winning victories but as doing justice, and therefore don't seek sentences that require mandatories when the facts wouldn't require such heavy punishment. That has not been our experience here.
Okay. A difference in the justice system can be all the difference in the world. Mr. Sterling, thanks so much for joining us today. What are your thoughts on this? Send me a couple of ideas. Byline at sunmedia.ca. It's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Stick around. We've got more to come. Criminals are after your license plates, and
ultimately, if they want it, they're going to be able to get it.
So what can you do to keep yourself from being the next victim? Does gun control work? John Locke wrote the book More Guns, Less Crime. He's up next. 2 nonstop blocks of discussing gun control. This is Byline.